Good evening, everybody. Welcome to History Author Talks. It's great to see you back again. You hear the gong behind me. That means that it's time to get going for another episode of History Author Talks. And I just wanted to give you some updates about some of the things that are going on here in the 10 Crucial Days historic area. I've been doing a lot of historic interpretation for schools that visit the sites of the 10 Crucial Days at Washington Crossing. Washington Crossing, Pennsylvania last week, we had 1,000 school children just in 1 week. Tomorrow I go back to Washington Crossing and we have another 200 school kids. I love doing these programs for the kids. They're so much fun. And I learn so much from the kids, but we really, I think it's so important that we support our historic sites. We also have a lot going on with The Crossing, the musical. We're going to be putting on a performance at Princeton Battlefield on July 2nd with some of the songs and some actors who are going to be singing some of the songs at Princeton Battlefield. So you're going to stay tuned. You're going to hear more about that. Obviously, I'll be posting some information about that. And as always, I want to remind everybody to support their historic sites. Now, with that in mind, I have a terrific guest this evening who has written a wonderful book for us. Bert Dunkerly is a historian, award-winning author, and speaker who is actively involved in historic preservation. Preservation and research. He works as a park ranger at Richmond National Battlefield Park. Among his books are 3 from the emerging Civil War series, To the Bitter End, Appomattox, Bennett Place, and the Surrender of the Confederacy, No Turning Back, The Guide to 1864 Overland Campaign, and Embattled Capital, a guide to Richmond during the American Civil War. He also blogs for the emerging Civil War and the emerging Revolutionary War era blog spot, and we're going to be talking about the emerging Revolutionary War series in just a moment. But with that, I'd like everyone to now introduce you to Bert Dunkerly. Bert, welcome to History Author Talks this evening.
Thank you for having me. And I see a lot of friends out there. So thanks for tuning in.
Exactly. This is like old home week at History Author Talks. It's always a lot of fun. So I very much appreciate that. So let's set the scene up here up front. So what about the title? Where's that come from?
So it's an unusual title, and it allows me to call the book The Unhappy Book. That's how I refer to it. So it's a quote from George Washington, who talks about unhappy catastrophes that will happen if the British cross the Hudson River from New York and invade New Jersey. Yeah, there it is. And I just love that phrase. It stuck with me, and I think it applies to a lot of things. There's unhappiness for the Americans. There's going to be a lot of unhappiness for the British, for loyalists, for civilians. As this unfolds over the next few years in New Jersey, there's so many catastrophes and a great deal of suffering. And so it's a way to encapsulate all that.
That's great. Great title. Great title. So as many of my regulars remember, on April 4th, we hosted Jim Stemple, author of The Enemy Harassed, Washington's New Jersey Campaign of 1777. And a few years ago, one of New Jersey's foremost historians of the American Revolution, Todd Brasted, published a book called The Grand Forage of 1778. Jim's book is a narrative on what Mark Lender coined as the Forage Wars and in New Jersey, and Todd's narrative is mostly on North Jersey. Both excellent reads. Unhappy Catastrophes is both a narrative and something other books are not. It's like it is like the other emerging Revolutionary War series books. It's an adventure guidebook to the sights and scenes of where everything happened. So tell us about the emerging Revolutionary War series.
Sure. It's a group of historians who love to research and write and explore. And we have a blog with articles that come out every week, and they focus on all kinds of interesting or little known topics. Sometimes they examine something that everybody knows about, but maybe from a new angle. And sometimes it's an article about something really obscure that you've never heard of, fun facts. And the series of books so far includes Trenton and Princeton, Valley Forge. Yeah, there's the website, Emerging Revolutionary War. And the other books that are coming out in the series will include Camden and Charleston in South Carolina. And what I really like about these books is that they provide a good overview of the event, but they also provide new insights and new perspectives, really cutting edge research. And they often focus on where to go and include guide information about sites to visit, a lot of them off the beaten path. So it's a good way to find the obscure things, which I like to do.
You know, it's terrific. Between the emerging Revolutionary War series and now Bruce Franklin at Westholme is publishing the Small Battle series, which features editorial guidance from Mark Lender and Jim Martin. And the Small Battle series really focus on some of these battles that are heretofore only footnotes in a lot of other big books. For the last few years, I have been monitoring, being in the publishing business, this is sort of the crazy geeky stuff that I do. I've been monitoring the number of books that keep coming out on America's wars. And for reasons which we can talk about here in a minute, the Revolutionary War seems to be building up momentum. Why is that, Bert?
I think that there's a lot of interest out there, and I think a lot of our audience shares interest in the Civil War, and a lot of the Civil War topics have been done or overdone. And you know, the Revolution is a whole new arena to explore. Fascinating topics. A lot of research still needs to be done on some of these sites. We may know the basics, but we need to dig a little deeper. And with the 250th anniversary coming, I think there's going to be a lot more excitement. I hope there is.
Indeed. So in his foreword for your book, Unhappy Catastrophes, our friend Todd Brasted did a stellar job summing up why New Jersey was so critical during the American Revolution. Give us your executive summary. What made New Jersey so important, and how did you come upon writing Unhappy Catastrophes?
Sure. Well, I love to tell the story of how it all started for me. I was working at Morristown National Historical Park, and I was there over the winter in 2017, 2018. And there was a tremendous snowstorm that gave us 2 feet, and everything in the area closed. The house I was living in lost power. A lot of houses lost power. And I ended up sleeping on the floor of the office of the park for a week because I was stuck. I had nowhere to go and no power at the house. And over those 3 days, I started to write the book. And I wrote the majority of it. I would go outside and shovel snow and take a break, go inside, write for a couple hours, then go back out, shovel some more snow. And I literally did that for 3 days. I had no human contact. You know, eventually things got opened up and we got sort of back to normal, but that's how the book started, as far as the actual writing of it. As to why this part of New Jersey is so important, several things. You might have heard the phrase crossroads of the revolution or cockpit of the revolution. Those are really true. The Continental Army will spend half of the war in New Jersey. And it's in this part of New Jersey that a lot of important developments take place. The Army progresses over time and becomes more organized, and it develops the support systems it needs to be able to function and carry on the war. Units get battle experience, troops become veterans. We have the professional development of the artillery training school. We have supply and logistical systems developed, the professionalization of the Army. Another thing is that the war never leaves New Jersey. And if you think about it, the revolution starts in New England, and the British pull out of Boston and evacuate, and they never come back. Now there is fighting in Rhode Island later, and of course there's fighting up in Vermont and upstate New York. When the British invade Pennsylvania and capture Philadelphia, they do that, but then they leave. New Jersey is one place where it's on the front lines the entire war. The British in New York City, on Staten Island, the Americans in New Jersey, constant warfare, raids, spying. New Jersey civilians will feel the impact of the war the entire time. They never get a break. Even when the main armies leave, there's still detachments that are there carrying on the war. And I think that also leads to my last point, which is really think to understand the war, you've got to look at this part of New Jersey, the central upper part of the state, because it's a microcosm of the whole war. The British have to control territory. The British have to try to support civilians and loyalists and encourage them. The Americans have to supply their army, train their army, maneuver, only fight battles where they are advantageous to them and not the British. And all those things, political, social, economic, military, all those things happen elsewhere in the war, but they all happen in New Jersey, and they happen from the beginning, and they happen throughout. So to understand so much of the conflict, you can look at examples here.
So my friend and partner Larry Kidder wrote what I think is really the best book that gives a sense of the militia, the organized militia in the American Revolution. Now, of course, militia was in every state, but with the armies being in New Jersey, for the entirety of the war, as you point out, the militia was constantly engaged throughout the entire war. Talk a little bit about the militia system and how the militia had to keep rotating through the war, and then we can talk about how I'd also like to get in a little bit more depth about how the Continental Army evolved during the war in New Jersey. But first, let's talk about the militia and how the militia was constantly reforming and being called up on a weekly basis, monthly basis throughout this period of time.
Sure. So every state or colony did have a militia system, except Pennsylvania, before the Revolution. Militia was the local police force. Militia would be called out for any kind of public emergency. So there was already a militia system in place. And when the revolution starts, the different states will turn to their militias for troops, obviously, as the war starts. And then you have the National Army, the Continental Army, but militia is still going to be relied upon to augment and support the Continental Army as needed. And you brought up the point that militia is going to be called out a lot at certain times in New Jersey. They had a rotation system, so you can't pull everybody out of a community at once. You've got to leave some of the men of fighting age at home for home defense, for law and order, while the select group goes out into the field. Because they were in the field so much and engaged in a lot of small scale skirmishing and raids, the New Jersey militia becomes pretty competent. They become pretty dependable. And that's really proven late in the war at the battles of Connecticut Farms and Springfield in 1780, when the British are going to launch 2 invasions to try to get towards Morristown, coming from Staten Island. And try as they might, they try to keep the order secret. They try to move at night. They try to move quickly. Every time the militia turns out, slows them down, and makes a critical difference. One thing that I think is really fun is the militia had a bonfire system on the mountains, so that if they saw the enemy approaching, they'd start lighting these bonfires, and you could see them from a distance. And that was the signal for people to turn out. So the militia system in New Jersey becomes well developed and very efficient.
So I encourage everyone to take a look for Larry Kidder's book, A People Harassed and Exhausted. It's excellent. Very, very well done. Thanks. That was a great explanation. Let's stick with the civilian population here a little bit. How do the citizens of New Jersey deal with this influx of thousands of men? I mean, they have their militia, but now you also have the influx of thousands of men, Continentals and foreigners, the British and Hessians. What was going on in the farms and towns of New Jersey during this period of time?
It was a real challenge for the civilians who lived in this area. I give a lot of credit to Governor William Livingston, who manages the state's affairs, I think, pretty well. He's got to manage, the militia system, the state's economy, local government, the state government, courts. He's got to keep everything running with a good part of his state under enemy occupation. And at times that occupation expands and contracts as the British go out on raids or occupy more territory or pull back. For civilians, there's a lot of reasons why a number of them would remain loyal and be loyalists and support the British, oppose the revolution. We do see families divided, communities divided. Probably the best example is Benjamin Franklin and his son William, who was the royal governor of New Jersey. And William Franklin had actually been pretty popular, but when the revolution starts and he stays loyal to England, he's placed under house arrest and then finally outright arrested and spends some time in prison. His wife passes away in British-held New York. They never see each other again. It's a tragic story there, but that's just one example. A lot of families were split. And New Jersey probably contributed about as many men to the Continental Army as they did to the Loyalist British Army, Loyalist units. There were a lot of New Jersey Loyalist units that fought for the British. And some of them end up in pretty far away places like the Carolinas or Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're talking about Livingston. I think of James Gigantino's book on William Livingston. That was an excellent biography of Livingston. And Larry Kidder also tells the story of when the war first started and they were trying to get in touch with the governor. They couldn't find him. And basically they were looking for Livingston, but he was constantly on the move because the British were certainly occupying the state. The format of unhappy catastrophes is very interesting. It's organized by theme rather than chronologically. Um, I'd like to sort of run through the table of contents a little bit to give folks a sense of how you put this together. I thought it was a great move on your part.
Thank you.
How did that come about? Before we talk about these themes, how did you come about doing it that way rather than just doing a chronological view, which is what Jim Stemple did with his book. Jim's was a narrative that started with the 10 crucial days and went through the Forage Wars into June and July. You do these themes. Is that how did you come about doing that?
I'm glad you asked that, because I normally approach writing and history chronologically, but I just felt like doing something different for this book. And the topics that I chose were the ones that stood out to me. So within each of these topics, the events are chronological, and overall they're fairly chronological in order. If you pull up the table of contents, we'll see that we go from the retreat across the state in 1776. We go into encampments. We go into small battles, then large battles, and then the home front and the war on civilians and raids. So I just thought those topics stood out, and I wanted to build the book around those.
So as long as you mention it, let's go ahead and do just that. Let's take a look. So there we go. I mean, this is the table of contents for Unhappy Catastrophes. So let's dive into this a little bit. July 2nd, 1776, the 30,000 British and Hessians land in Staten Island, and to Washington's 19,000 trying to defend 3 different islands, Staten, Long, and Manhattan. That didn't go about so well. August to mid-November, Washington goes 0-5. So not a great way to start a war. What goes into Washington's thinking to send Charles Lee north into the Hudson River, and he heads south with what he had left of his army down the New Jersey Turnpike? What was that thinking?
I think he's just trying to anticipate the British next move. The challenge that Washington has, and he learns it the hard way, is the British have naval superiority. And in a place that's defined by rivers, you just have the disadvantage, because the British can move anywhere they want to. They can go up the Hudson, they can go down the New Jersey coast. They can land troops anywhere in the region around Staten Island. And they do. That's how they capture Long Island and Manhattan, drive the Americans out of New York. So Washington just has to be able to anticipate, and they use forts like Fort Lee and some others. And that leads to Washington's quote about unhappy catastrophes that the British come over that river.
Yeah, for sure. We'll talk about the retreat a little bit more in detail, but in a minute. But let's go to chapter 2 with the encampments. So when one asks just the general public about the American Revolution, people get Lexington and Concord, maybe Washington crossing the Delaware, Saratoga, Valley Forge, and Yorktown. Valley Forge. What did he do all the rest of the winters? I mean, you have one winter in Valley Forge. What happened to all the other winters? Tell us about what happened.
And there's a great new book that came out actually last year, maybe, about the winters of the Revolution, and it studies the encampments.
In the winter,
yeah. I can't remember the author, Stephen.
Yeah, I got it right here.
Yeah, he's a friend of mine, so I hate that I can't remember. I can't remember his name.
Stephen
Elliott.
Yeah, I can't show it, but it's Stephen Elliott's Housing Washington's Army During the American Revolution. There we go. There you go.
Yeah, great book.
Yeah, excellent book.
So as far as the encampments, the Army spends, like I said, several years in New Jersey Valley Forge stands out because the supply system had really broken down, and there was a great deal of suffering in the army there. And there were a lot of casualties, a lot of fatalities that winter. But the winter wasn't necessarily that bad, relatively.
Yeah.
The army spent 2 winters at Morristown. The second winter was the really bad winter, where there were like 28 snowstorms. And despite that, the army
Including the
suffered
one
a
you
lot
got,
less.
including the one you got stuck in and started
Yeah,
writing.
yeah, felt like it. But by the time of that second Morristown encampment, the army had done this a few times. So they had a system in place. The huts are going to be this dimension. We're going to lay them out in a certain pattern. The placement of latrines and, all the layout of the camp, much better organized, better efficient than they had been in the past. And there were other encampments, Middlebrook, some others, and this leads to another interesting aspect of the revolution, and those are the mutinies. There were several mutinies that took place. The Pennsylvania troops mutinied for lack of pay and over enlistment terms. Later on, the New Jersey troops would mutiny. Washington all of a sudden has these mutinies breaking out everywhere, and he has to put a stop to it. And he does. I think the administration tried to be fair, but they had to be swift, and they had to respond with force, because mutiny is contagious. And if one group gets away with it, who knows where it ends. And by the way, the British are watching that very, very closely. They'd love to see nothing more than the American army just self-destruct. And they encouraged mutinies. They encouraged deserters. So Washington had to handle that very carefully, and he did. So lots of interesting things about the encampments in New Jersey. The artillery training school at Plekemen, the first American Army school of instruction. The Army is becoming professionalized. It's becoming better organized, and it's becoming legitimate. And the more that it does, the harder it is going to be for the British to defeat them. So these encampments are also training grounds at each of these encampments.
Yeah, and if you go to Pluckerman today, the Jacobus Vanderveer House has some really terrific information on that, and shows how the cantonment was set up in the woods there. And that Henry Knox's vision as an artillery training school up there was really the sort of the front runner for West Point.
Yeah, I mean, they built a dedicated classroom. That they built, training facilities, and that's a game changer, because it's not just this group of soldiers who are trying to wage a war against another group. They're training. They're creating a professional, well-trained army, and that's a game changer in the course of the revolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Middlebrook encampment, and some of the historic organizations in and around, what I call the Interstate 278 corridor there, along Bound Brook, the Abraham Stats House, the Washington Campground Association. They've created, Somerset County has actually created this tour of the 5 generals' houses, of some of the headquarters houses along there. It's a great little day-long tour. You learn a lot, and this is the sort of thing that you cover in Unhappy Catastrophes. That it's a guidebook really for anyone. And you give all of the contact information and website, and tell us a little bit about each of these areas. And that's why I kind of love this thematic um, organization that you've done, because you you can take different types of tours that will cover the encampments or the raids or the, so that's why I think it's a great book great reference book to have along with your terrific narrative. Um, so we talked a little bit about the militia and being called out on a regular basis. Let's talk about the Continentals a little bit more. Washington and the Army, as you've already stated, spent more time in New Jersey than any of the other states. Explain the evolution of the Army from 77, the second establishment, through the end of the war, and um, how did the Army evolve during this period of time, along with the officer corps?
Sure. I think this is one of the underappreciated aspects of this, and it's something that I really jumped on when I studied this because it's so important. A lot of people know that when the Continental Army was created in 1776, the enlistments were for 1 year. So uh, you might have heard about Washington being anxious at the Battle of Trenton because he wanted to attack before his enlistments ran out. And that's absolutely true. A lot of the Army, not all of it, but a lot of those troops had 1 year enlistments that were going to be up at the end of 1776. And so Trenton and Princeton happen, and some troops stay on longer, and new units arrive, and some have different enlistment periods. But what we see in the spring of 1777, when the Army moves to Morristown and sets up a camp scattered around the area, we see a whole influx of new units. Previously, we had a lot of New England units, and now we're seeing new units that are from Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, Virginia. And it's what I call the second creation of the Continental Army. That's the army that's going to fight for the rest of the war. Those men have long-term enlistments, 3 years or the duration of the war, whichever comes first. We know it's not going to be 3 years. But what's really important is the fact that I think in our general understanding of the Revolution, we go from Trenton and Princeton to then the British go around and invade Pennsylvania, Brandywine, Germantown, Valley Forge, Philadelphia. Well, there's a big gap that we're missing there. Through the spring and summer of 1777, that new second version of the Continental Army gets a lot of combat experience in the Forage War and then in several small scale battles before the British launched that Pennsylvania invasion. Yeah, the map there shows you a lot of these smaller battles. So it's important because you've got brand new units who've arrived in New Jersey, and they start fighting small scale battles, maybe a regiment or two at a time. And then we have the battle at Bound Brook, or the battle at the Short Hills. And those involve regiments and brigades, and sometimes later divisions in some of the maneuvering around Middlebrook and New Brunswick that summer. And so the army that's going to fight at Brandywine, which is a huge battle, and Germantown, some of the biggest battles of the war, that army gets its first taste of combat here in this part of New Jersey that summer and spring. So everything they learn about maneuvering, about skirmishing, all those intricacies of combat, it's the little stuff. How you go from a column into a line of battle, how you advance skirmishers, how you pull back. It's minutia, but it's important. And they learn all that here, so that when the army goes to fight at Brandywine and Germantown and winter at Valley Forge, that army is trained, ready, and much more experienced. So it's a really crucial step in the development of the Continental Army. And this army will fight through the rest of the war. Monmouth, battles in upstate New York, and then Yorktown eventually.
So I'm going to go out on a limb here a little bit. You know John Moss?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So John is writing a book right now on the turning points, plural, of the American Revolution. You know, you ask people about the turning point of the revolution. Well, most people come up with Saratoga. Of course, those of us here in 10 Crucial Days historic area say, well, we were the first turning point. And then you get, you know, the guys down south were saying, no, Kings Mountain or Camden or, you know, whatever. There were multiple turning points in the American Revolution. And what's interesting is that, and there is a question here. I'm sort of asking your opinion on this. You know, with the loss of Burgoyne's army in Saratoga, the simple thing to state in the textbooks is it was because of the loss in Saratoga that the French decided to join the war, join the American cause. Well, there's also a school of thought that they were looking at, despite the fact that the Americans lost the Philadelphia campaign, there was some spunk there, and the French were really looking at how the Americans fought during the Philadelphia campaign, and that was, at least in part, what also convinced the French that, you know what, it might be worth helping these guys out. I mean, this is what do you think of that theory?
Yeah, definitely. You know, Brandywine is a defeat. No two ways about it. But the American army puts up a hell of a fight that day, and the British take a lot of casualties. And I think everybody was impressed when just a few weeks later, Washington launches an attack on the British at Philadelphia, at Germantown. He's aggressive. The army recovered and was able to be back in action. And Germantown is a near run thing. So yeah, Saratoga, of course, is a clear cut victory and a game changer, the surrender of an entire army. But the other army under Washington in Pennsylvania is fighting very well. And I think that combined with Saratoga showed the French that this is worth supporting outright. You know, they'd been supplying weapons and giving us loans all along, but now it's time to take it to the next step.
Right. All right. So let's go back to the Forage Wars here a little bit. Your chapter 3 in your book, you talk about the Forage Wars and the War on the Plains, which was this continuous fighting. I mean, really, in 1777, 1778, all the way, all the way up to 1781. I mean, there's continuous fighting going on. But 77 and 78, there was a whole host of battles that were almost, I hate to say it, but almost training exercises, just as you have explained, because you have new units coming all the time, because that's where the British were. The British were held up along the Raritan River at Brunswick and in New York, and they were trying to get, I mean, their only supplies were coming from 3,000 miles away. They kept trying to go out into the countryside, not only get supplies, but to draw Washington's army out in the open field. And Washington couldn't afford to bring his army out into the open field. So there were a lot of these bee stings, constant bee stings. Hence the title of Jim Stemple's book, The Enemy Harassed. They were constantly going after the British. And this was really a big part of the Civil War. Now, let's talk about the demographics of New Jersey during this period of time. I mean, you had East Jersey and West Jersey, and there were obviously citizens who were loyal to the cause and loyalists in both East Jersey and West Jersey, or today what we call North Jersey and South Jersey. But right in the middle, in what is essentially central Jersey, where you're writing about, that's where a lot of these clashes are taking place. And what was the reason why you mentioned earlier there were so many loyalists in New Jersey? Why?
You know, it's complicated, like a lot of things in history are, but a lot of people have economic ties to England or the English economy, um, political ties, family ties, things like that. Um, you know, the revolution is teetering at many points, and if you were alive in 1777 or 1780, you might look at this and say, there's no way that these guys are going to win. Uh, the Americans are hanging on, but the British have overwhelming numbers and resources. As we know, that always doesn't make the difference in history. But you know, obviously, there's always a lot of people who are opportunists, switching sides, you know, just going with the flavor of the day, what's going to be best for them and their situation, and that it again, it poses challenges for Governor Livingston, for General Washington, to try to maintain public support for the war effort, because Washington is very well aware that the Continental Army has to have legitimacy. It has to be respectable. It has to be representing the American people. It is, in that it's made up of civilian soldiers, citizen soldiers who are volunteers for the most part. But the army has to be respectful of the people it's defending. And Washington has to walk a fine line with, you know, requisitioning supplies and, you know, the call outs of the state militia. And the governor has to do the same thing. But at times there's just no easy answer. And, you know, at times like this, that there isn't freedom of speech. There isn't freedom of the press. That, you know, you have to show that you're supporting this cause, or you're going to be in jail.
Yeah.
You have to sort of force people to make a decision, and that's probably going a little bit beyond your question, but
Yeah, no,
it's really important here.
yeah, no, it's fascinating. And you know, it comes it comes to bear throughout the war, because you might have farms right next to each other. I mean, your colleague, your ERW colleague, Dan Welsh, talked to you in one of your earlier interviews about how New Jersey is to the Revolution as Virginia is to the Civil War. That there was so much going on in the state. That's really where a lot of the battles were fought. Let's talk about some of these battles a little bit. You have a couple of chapters. You break it down into the battles versus the raids, which I thought was great. And you know, I love I love some of these smaller battles. You know, things like, you know, Quibbletown and Spanktown and Vealtown, and you know, which are all have modern names now. Spanktown is Rahway, New Jersey. Quibbletown is in Piscataway Township. So, but some of the major battles that took place in New Jersey. I mean, we know about Washington crossing the Delaware and Trenton. I'm on the audience tonight. We have my friend David Price, who wrote the Road to Assunpink Creek. I'm on a mission for people to stop calling it the Second Battle of Trenton, because it really was the first Battle of Princeton. The Battle of Assunpink Creek was the major battle as far as I'm concerned. What are some of the other? Tell us about some of the other major battles in New Jersey.
Yeah, there are a couple battles that spring and summer of 1777. I call them medium sized. They're not little skirmishes. They're not big battles, but they involve several regiments or brigades, along with artillery and cavalry, and they're good sized engagements. And so one of them is Bound Brook. which was an American fortified position. And in April, the British developed a plan to close in on it from 4 sides. Talk about coordination and a lot of planning. And of course, all the columns don't do the right thing at the right time, so it doesn't quite work. But the Americans are forced back. It is a British victory, but in the end, they have to withdraw, and it's kind of the standard scenario. The British win the battle, but they have to pull back to their safety of their lines. So that's an interesting engagement, and there's still some historic remnants and historic markers there today.
Yep.
Another one is that I thought was really interesting is the Battle of the Short Hills, which is another British advance, overrunning some initial Americans, and then reinforcements come up, and we develop into a good-sized battle with several regiments fighting against each other. And
So
I have a map here. Could I share my screen?
Yeah, sure. Let me give you the authorization to share your screen here. Yeah, the Battle of the Short Hills, or as we like to say, the Battle of Plainfield Country Club.
Yes, yes. So let me pull up a map or two here to show this. Bear with me here.
And
So,
audience, but before you go, Bert,
yeah.
Let me just say to everybody, I do see your questions in the chat, everybody, and if you have other questions for Bert, I'm gonna launch into those questions in just a few minutes. So, go ahead, Bert.
Sure. So this is late June of 1777. The British have 2 columns come out of Perth Amboy, lower right-hand corner of the map, and you see them moving up towards Oak Hill, that intersection, and the Short Hills. This shows you the big picture. We're going to have a full division of troops under General Sterling on the American side there. Apologize, this map is not easy to read, but this shows you an area that was studied to try to determine the actual location of the battlefield and the modern development there around Plainfield. And this is a more helpful map that shows, as best as could be determined, the troop positions, the British in red, the Americans in blue. And that blue shaded area is what we're looking at for preservation. But anyway, it's a good sized battle. And these troops will not fight another battle this large until they get to Brandywine. So it goes back to my earlier point about this is really important in the development of the Army that year.
That's terrific. Yeah, that's great. We're right now, the 10 Crucial Days tours is really just Washington Crossing, Trenton, and Princeton. We're actually now putting together a new tour, which is the prelude to the 10 Crucial Days, where we're going to be doing Petticoat Junction and Mount Holly and Burlington and Bristol. But I dream of putting together another tour that encompasses this whole area that you're talking about. I think that would be a great tour. Which kind of leads me now into the question of the idea of how do we recognize all of this? I mean, the difference. Yeah, I talked earlier about how New Jersey is to the Rev War as Virginia is to the Civil War. The difference being that New Jersey is so developed with massive urban centers and suburban sprawl, it's difficult to envision just how all-encompassing the revolution was in New Jersey. Why were the American Revolutionary War sites and battlefields less recognized than the Civil War sites? Being so close to New York, I guess there was just too much development.
Well, that's absolutely part of it, is especially when you get into the early part of the 20th century and the rapid growth of New York City area and the Philadelphia area. But, I think a more important reason is that Civil War veterans were alive to create battlefield parks in the 1880s and 1890s. Revolutionary War veterans were not around in the 1880s to create revolutionary battlefield parks. The revolutionary generation largely passes away in the 1820s, 30s, 40s. If you hang on a little longer, but preserving historic sites, battlefield parks, putting up monuments was just not a thing yet in American culture.
You were too busy starting a country.
Yeah. So, there are a few early Revolutionary War monuments, and there are a few things that are preserved and marked from the Revolution by that generation. But overall, it doesn't happen yet until after the Civil War and we get up to the 20th century.
Well, I think it's important for all of us now, particularly as we are heading toward America 250, the 250th celebration of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Of course, the lineage organizations like the Sons of the Revolution and the Sons of the American Revolution and the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, we're all starting to work together to recognize some of these sites. Here in New Jersey, we have a very exciting event coming up on June 25th. We're recognizing the gravesite of Jacob Francis, who was a Black soldier who crossed the Delaware with Washington and settled in Flemington, New Jersey, and was one of those militiamen that we were just talking about earlier on in the program, who fought throughout the entire war. That also comes from another book by Larry Kidder, the Revolutionary World of a Free Black Man. So let's see what kind of questions we have here from folks. Brooks Lyles, who's the Historian General of the Sons of the American Revolution, says there are two things that General Washington and his army had to learn. First, how to fight. Second, how to win. They demonstrated their ability to fight long before they learned how to win. Just an observation, he says, but it's this bears fruit to exactly what you were talking about, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's so much more than battles. It's what I call managing the war effort: recruitment, training, supply, logistics, maneuver. It's all those things that are not exciting and not sexy. They're behind the scenes, but they're absolutely crucial for the army to do its thing and fight and win. Even if the army doesn't always win, you got to have those other things in place. And that's what we see developing over time in New Jersey.
One of my other SAR colleagues, Andy Akers up in New Hampshire, asked the question, is it known what level of depredation both sides suffered during this period?
I think it's possible to know, maybe not in every detail, but there's good records in a lot of cases about what was taken by both sides, because both sides are going to raid the New Jersey countryside for supplies. So yes, I haven't looked at it that closely. Todd Braystead's book does a great job. The Grand Forage, check that book out.
Right, exactly. Brooks Lyles asked the question, how did the British manage to lose the battle for the hearts and minds of the New Jersey civilian population so quickly and completely?
They can't protect them. Simple as that.
Yeah.
And all these things are cumulative. So that winter of 1776 into 7, the British occupy, the northern half of the state. They control all the major towns and ports. But that slowly gets chipped away over the spring with the forage war. The British can't send a supply convoy out to gather supplies without it being attacked. And it gets to the point where every day they send a patrol or a convoy out, and it's just going to get attacked. And they, by the end of that summer, they've kind of given up. And there's bringing in supplies from England, and that's not sustainable. You can't feed an army of 10,000 troops with all their animals on a supply line that goes back to England. They just are cut off from the local source of supplies. So for the loyalists who, with all good intentions, want to support the British and believe that that's the right thing to do, they see the British can't hold the ground they occupy. They can't control the countryside. They may advance and capture an area for a while, but then they leave and the Americans come back. So the British never set up a functioning royal government in place of the New Jersey state government.
Right.
There's no local courts. There's no local law and order. Just all that stuff.
Well, Bert, this has been terrific. I want to remind everybody that you can purchase Bert's book on historyauthortalks.com. There's a link up on the top menu bar that just says bookshop.org, and you'll find one of the bookshops listed in there has all of Bert's books. There's also a link for a book that says New Jersey and the Revolution, which of course has not only Unhappy Catastrophes, but some of the other books that we've talked about this evening. Enemy Harassed by Jim Stemple. We've got Mark Lender's book, Fatal Sunday, on the Battle of Monmouth. We've got Ed Lender's book on the Battle of Springfield. There was so much that happened in New Jersey that, and I think it's really now all coming to bear. So I'm excited about the work that you've done. I really appreciate it. It's a book that everyone needs to have, whether you live in New Jersey or not. It's a wonderful book, not only telling great stories, but also on telling about the different sites of the American Revolution. And everyone should always remember to support these Revolutionary War sites. They're open. These are open classrooms, and you support these sites, and it helps these organizations build on their education for local schools. I also appreciate it when people donate to 10crucialdays.org. It helps us support those sites as well, and educational initiatives. I also want to just mention that on November 15th of 2022, last year, I did an interview with General Jason Bone, who wrote a book called Washington's Marines. Well, that book just came out. So I interviewed him back in November when I reviewed the book before it came out. He asked me to read it before it came out to give him some thoughts on it. And that book just came out. So you can go to the past programs, Tam, of History Author Talks and watch that program again if you want. But certainly pick up your copy of Washington's Marines. That's also a terrific narrative. So I've given you a big reading list here, but you definitely ought to get Bert's book, Unhappy Catastrophes. Bert, I want to thank you this evening for joining us, and I appreciate your giving us the time. Please do check History Author Talks. I've got some other good programs coming up in the near future. And I want to thank you all for you giving me your time this evening on History Author Talks. I look forward to seeing you all again. Take care, and thanks, Bert.
Thank you, Roger.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.